Natural selection. You have probably heard this term before as it is applied to the process of evolution. And it is what Darwin identified as the primary way in which one species becomes another species eventually over very long periods of time. Well, that long period evolution from single-celled original organism to the millions of different species and everything, type of evolution is not really what we're going to talk about in here. The application or the things that we're really concerned about is the natural selection part of it, which happens over a short period of time, and it is observable, and it is the way in which organisms, and actually populations of organisms, will adapt to their environment, and therefore it is what will have relevance in this course because we talk about environmental change. And really it only takes place when we have that environmental change. So what we find is that when you have, like I said, when we talk about natural selection, it acts upon the population of organisms, not on individual organisms. Individual organisms do not evolve in the classical sense of the term, and natural selection does not act on them. It affects them, but does not change individual organisms. It changes a population of organisms because it does so by basically by filtering out the weaker organisms, the ones that are not as well adapted. Either they don't survive till they get to reproductive age, or once they get to reproductive age, they don't get to mate or mate less than more successful organisms, and therefore their less adapted genes do not get passed on to the next generation. So, as it says here, there are certain things that make some organisms better fit to survive in an environment. These properties and characteristics are known as adaptations. And a key thing, key property of these that we have to take into consideration when talking about natural selection is that they have to be heritable. What does that mean? I think heritable means, yeah, they have to be able to be inherited from one generation to another. Therefore, they must be genetic. They must be in the genes of that organism. Okay, and otherwise, that's the natural selection does not work. Natural selection happens from generation to generation, not within the lifetime of an organism. Okay. So, not only do these adaptations, these traits, which may be physiological, or anatomical, or they may be behavior related, as long as they're still passed on genetically, like instinctual behavior. Scientists are still not quite sure how that's passed on, but it is things that organisms do from generation to generation without having to actually learn them. These adaptations also, in order for them to work in natural selection, they have to make that organism better able to reproduce in their environment, more so than other organisms in that population. Okay, and because it is the reproduction, of course, which takes those traits to the next generation, and which can cause those traits to spread throughout a population. A lot of times we call this survival of the fittest. But I would change that to say survival and reproduction of the fittest would be perhaps a better way to put that. Now, the other thing I want you to appreciate about natural selection is the fact that it goes into neutral, so to speak, when the environment is steady. In other words, as environmental changes take place, you have this natural selection process going on, weeding out or trimming out those things that are not well adapted, those that are survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on. And so you hit a point where it stabilizes out. And no major changes in the population's, what we call gene pool, in the genetics of the whole population, take place. You have minor ones, of course. You have mutations that come in there. You have the recessive genes that are still around that show up in everything in many cases. But otherwise, it stays about the same. It's only when you have a change in the environment that natural selection starts to take place. You have environmental change. And of course, that's what this course is about, how we change the environment. So a lot of times these environmental changes may be caused by humans. And so what happens over several generations. So an example I like to give is one of lions on the savannah in Africa. When the rains are good and therefore the grasses are healthy, and therefore the zebras and gazelles and wildebeest and all those things that eat the grass and that lions eat, their population numbers are up. In that particular situation, it will be a good prediction to say that the strongest male lions will be the ones that not only survive but actually obtain breeding rights, so to speak. Lions are a type of organism that practices selective breeding or competitive mating is another way to look at that, and that the males fight it out with each other to see who's going to get a chance with the females. Okay, so they have a pride. And they have there'll be one male and several females in there that he mates with. So the bigger lions are the ones that usually are the ones that win out on the fights. Then you will see, when times are good, you will see larger lion offspring. They'll pass those traits on that made them big to their cubs. Then you have environmental change take place. So say you have a drought, and therefore the grasses recede, or maybe a disease that hits the grasses or whatever. And therefore there's less herbivores to eat. And therefore that malnourishment and malnutrition makes its way up the food chain. And it's no longer a great thing to be a big lion anymore. Because the bigger an organism is, the more that it has to eat. So they get weaker or sicker first. And this gives the opportunity for the smaller lions to come in and challenge the dominant lion in a pride. And so since they're smaller, they're better able to handle malnutrition, and probably they have lived through being the smaller ones and not having pride of their own. They've lived through starvation and having less to eat in general anyway. So they're better adapted to that. So they're going to come in, they'll chase the bigger lion out, which is not feeling too good anymore, and then mate with the lionesses and have smaller cubs. So after a while, you see the majority of those lions are smaller. The actual average size of that lion population will get smaller, will get lower, and therefore you have a change in what we call the gene pool. That's all the different genes that you find in the population of those organisms. And that's natural selection. Okay. The reason why that population of lions was able to continue on and survive is because they still had some small lions in there. So even though you got when that times are good, you got the male lions reproducing mostly, you're still going to have some smaller lions to get a chance to reproduce. And you're also still going to have, since there's many different genes that control recessive genes that pop up, and a male lion every once in a while a big lion is going to give birth to small cubs. And small, by small, I mean they will be small for the rest of their lives. Okay. So the reason why you have those things is because of genetic diversity. Now it's similar to biodiversity, in particular in the fact that it is good for the population. Now, biodiversity is good for an ecosystem. Genetic diversity is good for a population. And for the same reasons, though. Because when changes take place in an ecosystem that has a lot of different species, in other words, is biodiverse, then there are certain species, there's enough of the species around that can take those new conditions that they will, they'll carry on. And you'll still have an ecosystem there. With a population, when you have a change, there's enough of the type that are adapted to that change in the present population, then they will survive and they will spread those genes on to the next generation. Okay. So they can survive the environmental change. Now, of course, people mess things up. That could be the theme of this class by doing something called artificial selection. And we've been doing that for thousands of years, ever since we started domesticating plants and animals as part of the agricultural revolution that happened 10,000 years ago. I got your questions, please. So in the agricultural revolution, that's one of the things. In agriculture, you take certain varieties and breed them and crossbreed them and basically inbreed them. In other words, you'll take two perhaps from the same same family, and if they have a desirable trait, you'll put those together. And since the desirable trait is probably caused by the same gene, you're just magnifying that particular gene, its prominence, and therefore you're decreasing the genetic variation of that genetic diversity of those types of plants. So consequently, even though you get plants that will produce big ears of corn that have lots of kernels on them, whereas wild corn, it's like maybe a few inches long with maybe a dozen or so kernels on it, but very well adapted to its native environment, you're going to produce corn that is not. And since it's not well adapted to either the soil or the climate and the pests and everything, resistant to pests and all those other kind of things, we have to do things to those crops and animals, livestock, such as use fertilizer and pesticides and extra water than normal. All of these things, because we have produced these things that can't survive without our help, but they produce big tomatoes, lots of corn, etc. And so that is the process of artificial selection. That's the environmental impact that comes along with it, is the fact that we have to do so much more to keep these things alive and make them survive. And there's also an issue with the fact that, particularly with plants, that they can crossbreed with native species. So the pollen can get blown out or carried by pollinators of domestic corn, for example, or wheat. And there's a good chance where these things are grown that there's a wild variety that they can mate with in the wild, and therefore those genes get transferred to the wild population, and that weakens that wild population. So you've got both the extra use of pesticides, fertilizers, and water that comes with using these artificially selected food crops and livestock, and also the potential for their weaker genes to get out in the natural environment. And I'll recall you back to when we talked about agriculture, we talked about heirloom varieties and how that tries to help compensate for that, but that's the way it is for now, at least. So how does nature ensure genetic variation? What's the main process in nature that does that? Well, everybody's favorite subject. Sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. That's the only purpose it serves. Okay? It actually is very inefficient when you look at how efficient asexual reproduction is. You can take one bacteria, it doesn't need another partner. One bacteria can become 1 million bacteria in 24 hours. It's given all the food and everything to do so. There's no sexually reproductive organism that comes anywhere near that rate of reproduction. The problem, of course, with that is that all 1 million of those bacteria will be, for the most part, genetically identical, except maybe for mutations and things.